we can have a brief session of question answers, and I would really request that whoever has a question puts their hands up, and we will take it bit by bit, like we'll take set of questions. So there is one question there, 1, 2, 3, 4, please. And Kamla ma'am also has a question. Can we have a mic? Yeah, that I'll take 4 questions and then 4 questions again.
Thank you very much, Professor Mehta. I really identified with the dread. You know, I remember Professor Rampuniani is here. In my thesis, I had vehemently argued against the nation state. And the dread seems to be that the nation state has arrived. This is not a question to you, but I think what I went back to when you were talking today are 2 novels written by Rabindranath Tagore. I was instantly taken back to Gora and Home and the World. And in both his works, he talks about, through his characters, he urges the characters to emerge out of the shackles of patriotism. And he cautions us against the making of the nation. He cautions us against giving structure to the abstract at the cost of effacing the liberated individual. I'm really hopeful for all of us here, and yet today I go back with the dread. And the dread, I think, started seeping in when this Independence Day, all our collar tunes were changed to Ghar Ghar Tiranga without our consent. It is in our hands, really. Thank you very much. We will keep drawing from your political theorizing.
Thank you. We have very little time, so I request everyone to have their questions really brief. Yeah. So, or comments too. Yeah.
Hello, sir. Amazing lecture. My name is Priya Soli. So I just wanted to share with an incident. When the new parliament inauguration was happening, I was with my family watching it on TV. And there was a puja, a havan, and where all the priests walked in. And when we had discussion with friends, usually people said it's such a nice way to inaugurate, such a pious, such a pure way to start. But watching that, somewhere it angered us. It did not feel like a sign of secularism or a sign of where everybody equally wanted that to happen. So it angered us. I just wanted to ask you, was that anger justified, or are we just overreacting? Or if we are not overreacting and it is justified, how such subtle acts of homogenization can be questioned? Because we're just sitting back at home and questioning in the 4 walls, but everybody is getting away with what they really want to do. So I don't know if this question is even valid, but certain small acts happening around us, it makes me feel helpless that even though I do not really relate to it, or I don't really want it to happen, but I'm so helpless and it's so normalized that there is no other way other than take it all in. So that's it, sir. What, as a normal citizen of this country, what can we do? Just sit there and discuss with the team, or just feel, yes, ऐसा तो ऐसा ही होता है, अभी ऐसा ही होगा?
Hi, so we have a compiled question actually. Me and my friend, we both are from TISS, and I think we both either miscomprehended or we need clarification of the last part of the lecture. So you mentioned that how it is important to transcend identity to be able to escape the identity trap that we are in. And while you mentioned it, you talked about that how by talking about the multiplicity of identities, we unwittingly give into the benchmark that has been set in of a singular identity of a nationalist, right? And so my question is that how do we break or transcend that identity trap when in the very first place, I'm not allowed to accept my identity even. I'm a queer woman in an upper caste household. I cannot tell my parents that I'm a queer person because they will throw me right out there. So when I'm not accepting it in the first place, how do I transcend it? And how do I deny the fact that I'm an upper caste woman? So it should be my onus and responsibility to give up that identity of being upper caste so that I'm not subjugating other Dalit, Muslim, tribal, Adivasi women. And then how do they transcend that identity? On that note, Aishwarya is going to...
So adding to that, like how even like how what is accepting an identity and what is recognizing an identity, because when we talk about the marginalized group, an Adivasi, a Dalit, a nomadic tribal person has been fighting for this identity. So how does it legitimize that these people have to give up? Because in the end, if we relate it to the climate just narrative, why does the onus have to be on the developing countries? Like the developed country should be the one to actually take initiative. So even here, why should the marginalized identities also have this onus of transcending when accepting and asserting itself has taken so much struggle for them?
Can we have one question? Just one question, then we'll come back with the other set of questions.
Thank you, Professor Mehta, for lifting the debate onto very, I wouldn't say abstract, but very, very broad terms. And I'm just making two comments. I'm not a political scientist. I have much more affinity with anthropology and history. So what struck me was that the whole argument is based on, I'm putting it in a very simplistic kind of anthropological manner, not political science lingo, but the kind of valorization of individual, to put it crudely, but that itself is pretty recent in human history. So for most of, before individualism and later nation state came into being, for several thousands and millions of years, we have existed as human beings in some sort of groups. They may not be our kind of categories that we talk of now, but group identity I don't want to use, but groups, we have functioned in groups. So this whole argument is very good, but it is pitched on a very contingent and a historically specific kind of idea which has taken root among us. So one point. Second is that your final, the way you kind of ended it, is that we should be able to interact on a human basis or on a one-to-one basis such that all these categories kind of fall off. Now in your study of history or the societies that have existed in the past, mythological or real, have there been such societies in a large way, not just individuals, where these identities have fallen off? And we can see it in some cases, self-realization of individual saints or monks or Sufis, but it has never, to my knowledge, been a kind of a cultures which have that kind of a thing. So is this not a kind of a utopian dream?
Thank you for these amazing questions, and I'll begin with the last two. I think they're connected in some ways. So you're absolutely right, Professor Ganesh. I mean, the idea of freedom, as I understand it, is recent, at least as a social and political project, right? But that actually doesn't worry me. I mean, I think the question to ask is not whether it's recent or not. The question to ask is, given our best understandings of where we are, what does it mean to honor the dignity and potential of every single individual? The fact that this is recent, I think, only underscores the difficulty of it. It only underscores the fragility of it. But I myself don't see the justification for any kind of rival candidate to that normative orienting value as a kind of starting point, right? I mean, and you can describe it in different languages, traditions. Dr. Engineer was just talking about Bulle Shah. You can describe it in Kantian language. But that, or the Mahabharata, right? For the sake of the human soul, which meant individual soul in some ways, right? The whole human race can be sacrificed. So the fact that it's recent as a social ideal, to me, I think I take it for granted. And I also take it for granted that it's going to be extremely fragile, right? The second thing I think I'd say, which may address some of your question, is, so look, of course, identities will matter. And identities will matter to people. In fact, it's part of a defense of freedom to be able to say people should be able to freely define whatever identities they wish, right? When Ambedkar was objecting to Gandhi's naming, right, of Harijans, he was objecting to two things, right? One, he was, of course, objecting to the sheer hubris and condescension that this is a culture that has controlled power by naming people in their identities. And even if this is benign, this is simply another version of that, right? But fundamentally what he says is, look, the ultimate power and dignity is the power of self-definition, right? Right? So in a free society, lots of identities will flourish. But for the purposes of our common life, right, those identities will, in a sense, be treated with like a kind of facticity, right? I'm not particularly at this moment thinking about the different colors of clothes you're wearing, although in certain contexts, that can actually become a very significant thing about you, right? And a free society, in some senses, is maintained precisely where that grammar of identity, right, is not something that either traps you as an individual in a script, right, or in some senses imposes the kinds of obligations on others, right, where you can't escape that, in some senses, identity. So those will be identities, in a sense, that are born of acts of freedom and the power of self-definition, not in some senses where we are working from identities to what rights we have or how we think of history or what beliefs, in some senses, that we might have. Now, of course, particularly in a country like India, there's an easy way of saying we don't recognize identities, where the purpose of saying that is to throw a cloak of anonymity over actually existing compulsory identities, right? Where we deny identity, in some senses, to deny privilege, as you said sometimes, right? To that extent, as a sociological fact, of course you have to take into account that those are scripts that are structuring people's behavior, right? You actually can't pretend that those scripts of privilege that come from those identities do not exist, right? I mean, that's just denying facts. That's just denying, in some senses, history, right? The question, I think, that follows is, in a sense, what is that moment of overcoming? And here, I think there is a bit of a challenge, which is recognizing that somebody is privileged and may be unjustly enjoying something that accrues as a result of that historical privilege, and that must be undone, is not the same thing as saying they are forever condemned to that identity in virtue of which they got that privilege. We will just now take that privilege away from them, right? The emancipatory potential of Ambedkar caste politics, right, was that in some senses it was that struggle for creating that space for individuality, right, for inclusion, for, in some senses, justice, right? But there is a very subtle and quick shift we make, right, where what we do in the process of articulating it is re-condemn us to another form of compulsory identity. It may be less privileged, it may not carry the same markers of oppression as the previous, but it's the compulsoriness of it, right? You are X and shall remain X, and there will be a script associated with X, right? Except now it's not given by rituals of purity and pollution, now it's given by, in some senses, legal sanction, right? So that's, in a sense, I think the real question. I mean, it's not about denying these facts of privilege associated with identity. It's basically that old song, right? Let freedom burst forth and just see what kinds of diversity and identities, in some senses, come in the wake. And the question of the ritual that you're talking about, the Havan. Look, if we were living in a culture and a politics where these were just matter of facts grammar, right? I mean, at one level, look, in a country like India, there's a very complicated cultural grammar by which you want to signify auspiciousness, on which you might want to signify good luck, lots of different things, right? If we were living in a public culture where this could be taken as just that, right? Maybe you could be cool about it. All individuals will have grammars in some senses. What makes it menacing is that it is again tied to a conception of privilege and a consumption of compulsoriness, right? This is a signifier of what being a Hindu now is, right? So it's that identification with that collectivity, that script, that's actually what makes it menacing, and therefore you're right to think of it as menacing in this context, where we are actually, in fact, the meaning of that ritual is, nobody is bothered about that meaning of that ritual other than the fact that it is actually an assertion of community power.